thought I would provide a little bit of scenery for these next couple of readings. We're going to continue on in our foundations of sensation and perception, and we're going to move over to and we're going to continue our series on the American Revolution because it's almost coming to the 4th of the month of July. But right now we're going to work on our physics and the biology of audition. We're going to study the auditory cortex and things of that nature. So this is the physics and biology of audition. Humans are generally considered to be highly visual animals. However, visual information is restricted to the immediate field of view, an angle of approximately 200 degrees centered on the line of sight in humans. And obviously we'll get to other things as well. We'll get to the sight as well, the senses of sight and perception. And obviously it relies on the presence of an adequate light source. Sounds can be sensed in all directions around the body, can even be sensed within limits through opaque occluding objects. Social and cultural communication in humans, for example, relies heavily on sound stimuli in the forms of language and music, for example. Individuals lacking the sense of hearing are severely limited in their ability to communicate with others and are also at greater risk of injury from hazards outside the field of view. Of course, indeed, recent research indicates that the increased use of headphones while walking in urban environments is a significant risk factor in pedestrian injuries, particularly among young people. Of course, we will provide an introduction to the physical properties of sound and to the biology of the sensory apparatus that humans use to sense sound. The following concentrates on perceptual aspects of audition, building on the knowledge acquired. We have sound as physical stimulus. Sound consists of pressure waves carried by vibrating air molecules. It is usually produced by a vibrating surface. For example, when a gong vibrates after being struck, it pushes to and fro on the surrounding air molecules. The resulting pressure changes are passed on by collisions between the air molecules, and the sound waves travel away from the gong at a speed of approximately 335 meters per second, or MPS. And parts of the wave where air pressure is increased are called compressions, and parts where pressure is decreased are called refractions. And so a sine wave is a wave whose height, for example, varies smoothly so that it conforms to a mathematical sine function of time or distance. An adjective of that would be sinusoidal. We have other aspects of simple sounds such as frequency. The unit of frequency is hertz, named after the 19th century German physicist Heinrich Hertz. He talks about sine, pressure, and frequency. Of course, you might ask the question, what is the mathematical relationship between frequency and wavelength? And of course, we have formulas for amplitude, okay, and frequency. We also have decibels and sound pressure level. So frequency is the number of cycles or periods that a wave per unit of time or distance. And of course we have the amplitude, which is the maximum height of a wave measured from its mean value to its maximum value. The decibel is a measure of the difference between two quantities based on the logarithm of their ratio. For example, so equal ratios between the quantities correspond to equal decibel differences. And sound pressure level, or SPL, is a decimal measure of sound pressure relative to a fixed reference pressure. Then we have phase. Phase defines or denotes a particular point in the cycle of a waveform and is usually measured as phase angle in degrees. So between 0 and 360 degrees, or radians, which would be from 0 to 2 pi, 2 times pi. Of course, a complex wave is a wave that can be decomposed into a collection of simple sinusoidal waves. And then we have complex sounds. Complex sounds would be, for example, the Fourier spectrum and analysis, spectrograms, frequency filters, and things of that nature, transfer functions, and linear filter. Okay, and then nonlinear filter. And then we got the physiology of the auditory system. The fundamental frequency is the lowest sinusoidal frequency in a complex wave, while a harmonic frequency is a sinusoidal component in a complex wave having a frequency that is an integer multiple of the fundamental frequency. The Fourier analysis is the mathematical procedure by which a complex signal is decomposed into its magnitude spectrum and phase spectrum. The Fourier spectrum is a representation of the magnitude of individual frequency components that are present in a signal such as a sound wave. It is also known as the magnitude spectrum. And then we have the phase spectrum, which is a representation of the phases of individual frequency components present in a signal. So we could have, for example, the complex signal, a Fourier analysis, a Fourier spectrum, and a Fourier synthesis. A Fourier analysis can decompose a complex signal into its frequency components, which can be displayed visually in a Fourier spectrum. The original signal can be recovered by the reverse operation called a Fourier synthesis. And then the spectrogram is a graphical representation of changes in the frequency content of a signal over time. And we have, over time, we have the frequency over time. And, okay, so anyways, there is a frequency filter as well, which is any process that modifies the frequency content of signals passing through it. Of course, that's why they are called filters. All right, and Fourier transform. Okay. The frequency is measured in hertz. We also have transfer functions, which is a function that describes a linear filter's frequency response in terms of the degree or attenuation at each frequency. We have also linearity. And of course, a linear filter is a frequency filter that modifies the amplitude of input frequency components, but it does not introduce components that were not present in the input. Of course, the use of Fourier theory to analyze the properties of an acoustic filter depends critically on the assumption that the filter is linear. And of course, it is often the application of the Fourier theory to linear systems is most likely called linear systems theory. Of course, a nonlinear filter, of course, would be a frequency filter that distorts signals by adding new frequencies or by failing to respond at very low or high amplitudes. And of course, we have examples of linear and nonlinear responses to simple stimuli. Input waveform, linear output, nonlinear output. We get to the physiology of the auditory system. We have the outer ear and the ear canal. The others were in terms of frequency and audition. This one's on the physiology of the auditory system. The outer ear, of course, is the outermost components of the auditory system, the pinna, the meatus, and the ear canal. The ear canal, is the S-shaped tube, for example, that leads from the meatus to the tympanic membrane, is approximately 0.6 centimeters wide and 2.5 centimeters long. All right. And this is when you learned in anatomy and physiology about the ear. You learned about the incus, and you learned about the tympanic membrane, the vestibular nerve, the cochlear nerve, the vestibule, and things like that, the tympanic membrane, and the external auditory meatus. Okay, so we're going to learn about some of these terms. Okay, the meatus is the opening into the ear canal. The tympanic membrane is the flexible cone-shaped membrane extending across the inner end of the ear canal, and it transmits sound energy to the middle ear. Then there is the pinna, which is the external ear that is visible on either side of the head. It is funnel-shaped on the inner part, which is the concha, or concha, funnels sound into the meatus. The middle ear The air-filled cavity that contains the bones and associated supporting structures that transfer sound energy from the outer ear to the inner part of the ear. And then we have the oval window. It's a hawk over there. Okay. Well, the point of entry for sound energy into the inner ear, it is a small membrane-covered opening in the cochlea. I don't know how to say that. I've heard people say it ever since podiatrists and all kind of people have to do that when they're looking in the ears of small children. Okay, so we have impedance, what is called impedance, which is the degree of resistance offered by a medium to an oscillating signal. We have impedance matching, which is the boost in pressure at the oval window provided by the mechanical properties of the middle ear. It matches up the differing acoustic impedances of air and inner ear fluid. Inner ear fluid. Inner ear is the fluid-filled organ that lies in the temporal bone. It contains mechanoreceptors for hearing and balance. And of course, we went over that in the chemical senses section. And the cochlea is the spiral-shaped structure in the inner ear, which contains mechanoreceptors for hearing. And then there's the mechanical properties of the ear. There's the scala vestibuli, the tube running along the cochlea and that contains the oval window at its base, the scala tympani, which is the tube running along the cochlea that contains the round window at its base. Scala media, the tube that runs between the scala vestibuli and scala tympani. The cochlear partition, the flexible structure that separates the scala tympani and scala media and houses the scala media. The basilar membrane, the flexible structure on the cochlear partition that houses mechanoreceptors. It forms part of the organ of Corti. A traveling wave is the ripple of displacement that travels along the basilar membrane when the sound vibrations are applied to the oval window. And then we have frequency to place conversion, which is an encoding scheme in which the place of maximum displacement on the basilar membrane codes the frequency of sound vibration. And so at different for example, frequency tuning curves at a specific point on the basilar membrane in a live animal, and post-mortem as well. So adapted from the map of frequencies that produce maximum displacement at points along the basilar membrane. High frequencies displace the base of the membrane, and low frequencies displace the apex. Note the approximately logarithmic variation in frequency with distance along the membrane. For example, the distance between 1000 Hz and 2000 Hz points is equal to the distance between the 2000 Hz and 4000 Hz points. And of course, the organ of Corti, or Corti, is the complex structure that forms part of the cochlear partition. It contains mechanoreceptors sandwiched between two flexible membranes. The tectorial membrane is the flexible structure lying on the top of the basilar membrane. We have inner hair cells and outer hair cells that I won't go into. We have autoacoustic emission, which is a sound emitted from the ear. It either is spontaneous or it follows an auditory stimulation. And then another thing called phase locking, which is the firing of hair cells in synchrony with the variation of pressure in a sound wave. And then we get to dynamic change. Dynamic change is in a term in auditory nerve fibers. It is the difference between the minimum SBL to which a fiber responds and the SBL at the fiber's maximum firing rate. Again, remember when we went over SBL? SBL is the decibel measure of sound pressure relative to a fixed reference pressure. SBL is sound pressure level. So what we're saying is that dynamic range is that in auditory nerve fibers, it is the difference between the minimum sound pressure level to which a fiber responds and the sound pressure level at the fiber's maximum firing rate. Okay. Then we have what's called two-tone suppression. Suppression of an auditory nerve fiber's response to a tone during presentation of a second tone. And then we have the ascending auditory pathway, which is a schematic diagram of the ascending auditory pathway. Binaural responses appear first in the superior olive, which contains special neural circuits that compute where a sound originates in auditory space. The monaural projection from each cochlear nucleus to the inferior cocci or colliculi may carry information about what the sound is. And the cochlear nucleus is the mass of nerve cells in the brainstem where auditory nerve fibers terminate. Then we have the superior olive, the medial geniculate nucleus, which is the obligatory relay station for all ascending projections in the auditory system, en route to the cortex. Is that azimuth is the direction in which the horizontal plane is relative to straight ahead. We have what's called Watt processing and where processing. The Watt attributes of a sound include its frequency composition and its temporal features such as phase properties, onset, and duration. The where processing, an important attribute of a sound, is the direction from which it originates. Sound localization allows us to orient ourselves to the potential danger of an unseen sound source, such as a predator. It also helps me to listen to the hawk over there that's been making its sounds all since the morning. But anyway, we have internaural time difference, ITD, which is a difference in time of arrival of an auditory stimulus at one ear relative to the other. And then we also have internaural level difference, or ILD, the difference in the intensity of an auditory stimulus arriving at the one ear relative to the other. For example, we could have a schematic diagram of a neural circuit in the medial superior olive that computes in internaural time differences. Each neuron, A through E, receives one excitatory input from the left cochlea, and then a second from the right cochlea. Axon length varies systematically, so that the axon to neuron A from the right cochlea is longer than the axon from left. The reverse applies to neuron E, and as a result, neuron A responds best to sound located near to the right ear. Although the sound reaches the right ear before the left, its signal is delayed due to the greater axon length. Right and left ear signals arrive at neuron A together. Neuron E responds best to sounds located near the left ear, and corresponds. There are responses in the array of neurons A through E that create a map of sound location. And the primary auditory cortex is the cortical destination of projections from the medial geniculate nucleus. Tonotopic organization, the descending auditory pathway. The tonotopic organization is an organized arrangement of neurons so that cells with similar frequency preferences lie close together in a neural structure. The auditory association cortex is two concentric bands of cortex encircling primary auditory cortex. It contains cells responsive to auditory stimuli. And then, so we just talked about the physics of sound and physiology and the peripheral auditory system and the central auditory system. Well, we talked about four-ear analysis. with even and odd functions, inner products, odd waveforms, even waveforms, complex numbers, magnitude, energy, and phase, periodic waveforms in the Fourier series, and so we have physics of sound. Sound waves consist of fluctuations in air pressure created by vibrating surfaces. A simple sound wave can be described as a sine wave having a specific frequency, amplitude, and phase. According to Fourier theory, a complex sound can be regarded as a collection of many simple sine waves added together. Fourier spectra and spectrograms offer graphical representations of the sine wave frequency components of complex sounds. And any transmitting device or medium can be viewed as a filter that preserves some Fourier components in a sound and attenuates or removes other components. The transfer function of the filter defines its ability to transmit sound components at different frequencies. Fourier theory can be used to characterize a filter's properties only if the filter can be assumed to be linear. The output of nonlinear filters contains frequency components that were not present in the input. The auditory system can be viewed as a complex processing system that contains both linear and nonlinear components. Concerning physiology, the auditory system can be divided into a peripheral part and a central part. Concerning the peripheral auditory system, the peripheral auditory system includes the outer ear, middle ear, and inner ear. The outer ear gathers sound energy and focuses it down the ear canal into the tympanic membrane. The vibrations of the tympanic membrane are transmitted by the middle ear ossicles to the inner ear. A major function of the middle ear is impedance matching. The organ of the inner ear, the cochlea, is spiral-shaped and filled with fluid. The cochlea is also divided along its length into three chambers. The basilar membrane forms part of one of the petitions. Its mechanical response achieves a frequency-to-place conversion of sound signals. The inner hair cells distributed along the basilar membrane are tuned to different characteristic frequencies by virtue of their location on the membrane, and their responses are phase-locked to the incoming sound waveform, or for frequencies up to 1 kilohertz. Outer hair cells in the cochlea act to amplify and fine-tune the responses of the inner hair cells. The sound frequency is coded in the auditory nerve by the tonotopic organization of the basilar membrane, and by phase locking of auditory nerve fiber impulses to the incoming sound wave. Sound intensity is coded in the auditory nerve by two populations of fibers, one responding at SPLs up to 60 decibels, and the other corresponding to SPLs up to 100 decibels. Concerning the central auditory system consists of several populations of cells in the brainstem and cerebral cortex. Auditory nerve responses from the hair cells arrive at the cochlear nuclei in the brainstem. A complex series of serial and parallel processing stages in the brainstem then conveys these signals to their destination in the auditory cortex. The Watt attributes of sound, such as frequency, composition, and temporal structure, are encoded by tonotopically organized neurons in the cochlear nuclei and at higher levels of processing. The where attributes of sound, location of the sound source in auditory space, for example, are encoded by binaural cells in the superior olive and higher levels of processing. Some binaural cells are sensitive to time differences, and others are sensitive to level differences. The auditory cortex preserves the distinction between what and where stimulus attributes in two streams of neural analysis. And again, we have much to cover, but I don't need to go into Fourier analysis and sensory systems or fast Fourier transform. And fast Fourier transform is FFT is a numerical computational technique for performing Fourier analysis on an array of signal values. And then we have the perception of sound.